compare the market for startups in Brazil and the US? I think this is one of the topics that
I think I can certainly speak from the vantage point of starting a company or being an entrepreneur, and I'd actually love to hear your perspective from being an investor. But I think that there's a handful of things that any entrepreneur needs to take into account when starting a business in Brazil. I think that the first one is around talent and experience. So as a person that's starting a company, you're going to have to build out a team. You're going to have to scale out that team. And I think the fact that Brazil, as many other emerging markets, just has less time in terms of the internet and technology compared to Silicon Valley. So when you think about Brazil being 5 or 7 years behind Silicon Valley, you just have less people that have the experience that you can bring on board. So you need to be able to build a team, and I think that's just significantly more challenging in a place like Brazil than it is in Silicon Valley, where you actually have a very large pool of qualified employees that you can bring on board. I think the other thing which a lot of people tend to focus on, and I actually don't think are significant barriers to an entrepreneur in Brazil, are around some of the bureaucratic and administrative challenges. Certainly Brazil is a much more complicated place to start a business and scale a business. I think a lot of the speakers have talked about the complexity around tax and labor and a bunch of other legislation, but these are generally solvable problems. They're a bit more of a headache, but you can hire someone that knows how to solve them and you can get through them. And I think that the last one, and this is probably something you can speak to a lot better than I can, is that there's just less capital. So if you're unable to get a top fund like Monashees or a couple of the handful of angel investors to invest in your company, your ability to raise capital from abroad or from other investors is actually quite limited. So having access to capital can be a big advantage and or challenge for anyone starting a company in Brazil. And I think that when you look at that, all those factors together, what it actually ends up producing is a market that has a lot less competition than you would have in Silicon Valley or in a more developed market, which means that if you are a company that's able to scale to some extent in Brazil, you're very likely to be the winner in that market. And Brazil is a huge market. I think companies that are 100% Brazil focused can build very large companies, and that actually ends up being a pretty big advantage for an entrepreneur. But I guess back to you, I'd love to hear from an investor standpoint how you would compare your experience in Brazil from that you've had abroad, or from co-investors that you've talked to before.
Yeah, I think they're very, very different. Of course, very different markets, and you touched some great points here. When you hear about the challenges in Brazil, you know, everybody talks about the talent pool that is more limited, and a lot of people talk about liquidity, and these are, in my opinion, the great challenges. Forming a team, finding entrepreneurs, anything in between. You know, when people say, oh, but the labor laws are terrible and the tax structure is terrible and everything is complicated, we don't see that as a problem. We see that it's not going to change. And there is a functioning economy with profitable companies, so you can build profitable companies in that environment. So everything else, in our opinion as investors, are entry barriers. And entry barriers are good. So there's a good side to it from an investor standpoint. Everybody says, well, the US is opposite, right? You have a lot of talent, you have a lot of liquidity opportunities, and everything is easy. And that creates another problem. So you don't have the entry barriers there, you have a lot of competition. So when people say, oh, I have a great idea, I want to be an entrepreneur, I'm going to the US because everything is easy there. Well, just go there, and the next day you're going to have like 20 companies that are better than you and have more capital than you. So the advantage of doing venture capital in Brazil and working with startups and entrepreneurs is exactly that the entry barriers is one of the biggest advantages. So if you have the resilience, if you have the resources, if you are willing to, you know, have tighter margins and longer takeoffs, you will get there and you can create some really nice monopolies. As you don't have a lot of competition, the pressure of competition is much lower. A second point that I think Brazil is very different from the US is in terms of exactly from an investor's perspective, you know, because it's so easy, you know, as we build our portfolio, I think it's easier in the US to be more of an index fund, you know, in early stage. So basically you invest in a lot of companies, you can be more hands-off, entrepreneurs, you know, are more independent and things are easier. So basically you can, as I've heard from like a top venture capitalist in the Valley, that, you know, in Silicon Valley, in doubt, lean forward. So you cannot miss, you know, the fear of missing out. You cannot miss the next Google or the next Facebook. In Brazil, it's the opposite. Basically, you don't have that. Things are difficult, and if you don't have the unicorns, so you cannot just. You have to be hands-on because things are difficult. You have to help entrepreneurs very closely. So when that happens, you don't scale that well. It cannot be an index fund. So you have to have a more selective portfolio. So we say in Brazil, in doubt, lean backwards. Just choose the best entrepreneurs in the right market spaces and work together with them, very hands-on, with a smaller portfolio for a Series A type investor. So I think that's the other difference. And the third difference I would point out is in terms of of people and entrepreneurs and the stage of the ecosystem in a more mature market like the US, basically entrepreneurs know how to work with venture capital. So they understand the drivers, they understand the motivations, they understand how to work. And in Brazil, entrepreneurs are learning how to do it. You know, you're a repatriate, you worked in Silicon Valley, so you knew when we worked together in Peixe Urbano, so you had this experience, so you were different from the average Brazilian entrepreneur. But in fact, and they're learning fast, but we're not there yet. So from the point of view of the entrepreneurs, they still have to, you know, learn how to get the best out of the investors. Because we have a history, especially in Brazil and Latin America, of a lot of conflict between entrepreneurs and investors. And we have to work together. We have to learn to work together.
I guess just if I could do a quick follow-up. You spoke a lot about talent and about the entrepreneur and backing the team. You know, are there specific things that you're looking for when making an investment in terms of the entrepreneur or the founding team that, I mean, I guess A, what are you looking for in Brazil? And I think B, which of those factors that you look for in making an investment in the team specifically do you think are more important in a country like Brazil than in Silicon Valley?
Well, that's the billion-dollar question, you know, and we try to, you know, that's how we spend, you know, our day-to-day, you know, looking at deal flow, looking at opportunities, and trying to find the best entrepreneurs. In the end, as we all know, and as we all say, you know, it's a people business. It's about human alignment in the long run. So I may emphasize some things, I may say some things here that other investors don't think it's that important, but in our case, I think first of all, we look really, you know, to understand the drive behind the entrepreneur's decision to build that company. You know, why are they building their company? What motivates them? What are the drivers? You know, why are they doing that? I think that tells a lot, and you don't get that in one presentation. You have to spend time with the entrepreneur to understand, because for us, we don't want the flipper, the guy that's going to be there for a couple of years and just sell the company, and other investors may find that well. But for us, it's really, we're looking for the entrepreneur that wants to build things to last in the long run. So finding that drive, you know, going through the speech and finding that drive, understanding that drive is critical for what we do. So that's one of the big things, but that's common. I don't know if there are like structural differences in terms of the entrepreneur that's very successful, the high impact entrepreneur in the US and a high impact entrepreneur in Brazil. But there are some things, like I think the fear of you know, this drive has to be associated with the courage to face the risk, and not having the, you know, don't having the fear of failing, which in Latin America, in Brazil, we all know, you know, there's a stigma of failure, as we all discuss. And the entrepreneur has to be, you know, willing to fail. And courage, actually, the definition of courage is not the absence of fear, but it's more like, you know, the willingness to do something is bigger than that fear. And as we see, because of this stigma, sometimes we see a lot of entrepreneurs that kind of in between. You know, they want to do it, but, you know, they can freak out at the first difficulty. I think that's very important. We like entrepreneurs that are insiders in the sense that at least they understand the pain they are trying to solve. ideally they felt that pain. We have a lot of entrepreneurs that are looking at completely different markets. They bring fresh perspectives, but we tend to prefer entrepreneurs because everything is so difficult. If they have a good idea of the pain they're trying to solve, I think that's another advantage that we see in a country like Brazil. We also look at another thing that we define as magnetism, is the ability to really attract people and talent and investors. And it's not charisma, it's something different. It's the ability, when you have a meeting with an entrepreneur that you end up investing in, you leave the meeting, really energized. You leave, there's an energy, there's a magnetism that doesn't have to do with charisma, but with how he believes in the idea, that I think it's very, very important for the whole process. We also want entrepreneurs that are authentic, that are confident, that they're not trying to please anybody. They really believe in what they're doing. And I'd say, finally, and most importantly, maybe, the values, the shared values that we have to have together. There's a sense of, this is a long-term partnership, so it has to be built over trust and respect, and we have to see that and that's why it's so important to spend time with the entrepreneur. But I would love to hear your opinion, as entrepreneur and also investor. But I mean, what do you see, as qualities of entrepreneurs? But also, what do you expect from investors, both as an investor or as a board member too? What do you expect as a board member in your?
I think complementing some of your points on the entrepreneur, you talked a little bit about drive and the motivation behind someone starting a company. And I think one of the things from my experience is probably, I would say, the most important attribute that I would look for in an entrepreneur starting a company in a place like Brazil, or I'd say in Latin America in general, is just perseverance, right? Things in Latin America are more complicated, they take longer, they're more painful, and you look at all the success cases that have been mentioned here today, Mercado Libre, B2W, Globant, all these guys, everyone went through the meat grinder at some point, and I think a lot of weak entrepreneurs or weak companies would have given up or would not have kept going, and I think the outcome of those stories would have been very different. So I think when you're investing in someone, having the drive or even that authenticity that you talked about why am I trying to solve this problem, and potentially because it's something that really matters to me, I think it's something that gives you that energy for you to keep going when things get really tough and sort of make it through, I guess, the meat grinder that I think starting a company in Latin America can often be. I think actually, sort of the other point actually on entrepreneurs, I do think that starting a company in a place like Brazil is like walking through a minefield, and you don't know what you don't know. And if you don't have, as an entrepreneur, the humility to understand that there are many mistakes that you're going to make if you don't listen to advisors, if you don't listen to other people's experiences, I think that's also fraught with potential to make wrong decisions and ultimately sink your company. So definitely one thing that I think I personally learned, and when I do make angel investments, I look for in entrepreneurs, is also the humility to want to learn from others and avoid making some of those very costly mistakes. And then I think going back to your second question about what I would advise an entrepreneur to look for in an investor or even in a board member, I would say that there's a couple of factors that are, I think, different in Brazil or in Latin America than you would look for in Silicon Valley. And I think that they're based on the fact that the market is just younger, the ecosystems aren't as large, people have less experience. So to some extent, you need to look to your investors or board members as someone that can fill in some of those gaps that the ecosystem doesn't have. So for example, I wouldn't typically tell an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley that you should look to your board member or to an investor as someone that's going to help you, benchmark your results results against other companies, or are going to help you learn best practices, because that information is very readily available. It's very easy to access from the ecosystem. In Brazil, the information still has a lot of holes, and I think a lot of times the investors are actually in a pretty privileged position to actually have the full story that you as an entrepreneur may not be able to have access to. So you can lean on board members to help you get the data, help you get the best practices that apply to your particular market. So I think that's something that's unique about Brazil. I think that the other thing, I guess, potentially going back to the point of humility and being an entrepreneur that wants to learn, is that, again, you're walking through a minefield, and a lot of times you need to be able to rely on, or you need to trust your investors and your board members to help you point to potential pitfalls that you might have ahead of you, because you simply wouldn't be able to identify those, and I think they're much more likely and much more numerous in a place like Brazil than in Silicon Valley. So in looking at investors, you want someone that has a good track record, obviously, someone that has invested in a lot of companies, and a lot of times someone that potentially maybe has worked in a startup or has some kind of operating experience, because I think that breadth and depth of experience is going to help that investor point you in the safest route or in the most effective route, given the market instability and some of the challenges that you see in the market. But if I can actually sort of switch a little bit here, and I guess switch the questions back to you again. Since arriving here in Miami yesterday and talking to a few of the folks in this room and out there, I think what everyone seems to be asking me is, what's going to happen with Brazil, right? The macroeconomic scenario is quite dire right now. No one knows how long the recession is going to last. How are you as an investor looking at that and changing your behavior, if at all?
Well, just to show, I don't think we have much time for that. I want to hear your opinion on that too. But I'll give you my take. We're very, very bullish on tech in Brazil, despite all the problems. I think we cannot drive looking at the rear mirror. The ecosystem is being formed. Now we see all the problems, all the turmoil. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. And 2 harsh years in front of us. We have to remember, GDP is not growing, there are economic problems, but tech is growing. E-commerce 25%, online advertising 32%. Our portfolio companies are growing 100% per year in revenues, despite the GDP growth. We all know that tech is detached from GDP growth. So in terms of tech, we would love to get GDP growth as a good tailwind, but it's going to happen. And we are approaching the liquidity events. I'm sure in the next couple of years, we'll create the wheels in motion phase for the market. So I'm very bullish about tech. I think economic situation will get worse before it gets better, but we'll get another upcycle. And we get a lot of calls these days from the contrarian investors, which are usually the smartest investors, calling and saying, well, now it's the time to invest in Brazil. We just raised our 7th fund in the middle of all this thing and had no problem raising the fund. So I think lots of indications that it's going in a good direction. I think there's this quote now from, from Jorge Paulo Lemann, that is a good one that says that, Brazil is never as good as they say. Brazil is never as good as it should, but it's never as bad as they say.
Yeah, I'd echo your point that you need to look at the tech sector a little separate than the macroeconomic scenario. I think just looking at the big numbers, right? Like you look at the population of Brazil, 200 million people. You look at a country where internet penetration is still comparatively very low, right? You're only about half the population online. Same thing with smartphone penetration, and all of those growing at considerable growth rates. You know that looking at a time horizon of 5 to 10 years, which is, if you're starting a company today, that's the time horizon you should be looking at. Maybe even 15 years if you're going to build a great public company starting out of Brazil. I think that some of the near-term or mid-term instability is something that's going to be, choppy waters for for the next couple of years, but eventually the long term you're going to be able to weather out. And when you look at how big technology and how big the internet has to be in Brazil, given all this growth and given the size of the population, you know that there's going to be companies that are going to be started today and that are obviously going to have to occupy that space. Because a lot of the companies that you're going to be looking at in the internet in the future aren't going to be global platforms that come to Brazil. You're certainly going to have a lot of those, but you're certainly going to have a lot that require local knowledge and local expertise and local operations to have success. And I think those companies are getting started this year. They're getting started next year. Some of them got started a couple years ago, and we're only going to see more and more of those exits, more and more of those success cases over the next 5 to 10 years.
And we're still going through the first generation of companies that are VC-backed, that started really in 2010, which I would consider the year zero of venture capital in Brazil. So we're still forming those companies. And there's a good number of great companies coming up. So that's why, you know, when these first companies just get, and the liquidity thing we all talked about, and I know we have only 1 minute, we are very, very confident that it is not a demand problem, it's a supply problem. So we don't see a lot of tech M&A because they're not great companies, great platforms. We're going to be a different market. You know, in the US, you have liquidity for everything. You know, great companies, so-so companies, bad companies. But in Brazil and Latin America, we're going to have liquidity for excellent companies. So we have to create excellent companies. And capital will be there, growth capital and liquidity. Well,
thank you guys.
That's it.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, 500 team.
Thanks, 500.
Thank you.